Good afternoon, everyone, from wherever in the world you may be joining us today. My name is Leila Dadus. I'm the YMERGE coordinator, and I would like to officially open the 15th session of the Distinguished Lecture in Emerging and Systematic Risk monthly lecture series, co-organized by Y-Emergency Fall York. Without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Professor Jiang Wu, Director of Y-Emerge, to introduce today's moderator. Dr. Wu, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Leila. Good day to everyone. On behalf of YMERGE, or the York Emergency Mitigation, Engagement, Response, and Governance Institute, would like to thank you all for the participation, and would like to particularly thank our distinguished speaker, Cheryl Rogers, with us, and all the panelists today in this particular session. The distinguished lecture series on emerging and systemic risks is coordinated by YMERGE in coordination with the CIFA Unitel and the Super Research Cluster on Urban Disaster and Health Emergency Systemic Risks. We're very pleased to see this distinguished lecture series has been providing a very important platform to bring together faculty members, our trainees, along with our members across the campus and around the world together to understand the research and training frontiers in the subject areas and on its impact on our society. And I would like to take the opportunity to also thank the moderator, Ada Mamugio, from here. And Dr. Mamugio is a social professor in the School of Administrative Studies in the Disaster Emergency Management Program. Her research expertise and leadership includes social vulnerability and capability in the disaster context, hosting and resettlement, international response to natural disasters, and risk assessment. Dr. Mamugio is currently working on a book project capturing the lived experience of many different types of vulnerable groups facing disasters across Canada. Before joining York University, Dr. Mamugio is a policy advisor and research in the formal Department of the Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development. We know now this is Global Affairs Canada. So thank you, Ada. So let me pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm very excited to be hearing Cheryl speak about emergencies and animal response, and I know for sure that you will all leave having learned a lot. I'd like to introduce Cheryl. Cheryl Rogers is a chartered professional accountant and has been involved as an animal disaster response volunteer since 1999. She is a founding member and national coordinator of the Canadian Disaster Animal Response Team, CDART, which was founded after Firestorm 2003 in British Columbia. And its main purpose at that time was to provide emergency services for domestic animals and to train volunteers. CDART is considered a lead agency by BC's Earthquake Review Board. Cheryl has broad experience in animal disaster response, including oiled bird rescue, BC wildfires, Hurricane Katrina, the Fort McMurray wildfire, the BC atmospheric river event in 2021, as well as planning for Fraser River freshets and the COVID-19 pandemic. Given this vast experience, Cheryl is considered a subject matter expert on animal disaster response, and over the last 2 decades has been invited to participate in various working groups and roundtables. She's presented at a variety of emergency preparedness conferences, and most recently presented at the 2023 Network of Emergency Support Services Teams Conference. She's also an author of a number of publications. Before I give the floor to you, Cheryl, I just want to ask that our participants please feel free to ask, think about questions that you have throughout the entire presentation, and you will have, I will present your questions to Cheryl at the end of her talk. There is a Q&A section box in your Zoom chat, in your Zoom kind of screen. So please feel free throughout the entire presentation to type in your questions whenever they come up, and then I will deliver them to Cheryl at the end. Please do so in the Q&A section, not in the chat box. It just helps with organizing things. So without further ado, thank you so much, Cheryl. The floor is yours.
And thank you very much. I hope I can live up to my introduction. I hardly recognize myself there. Just so everybody knows, I started responding when I was very young. And I would like to echo what Aida said. Just put your questions in the Q&A, and then we've got them, and we'll head out to them at the end. So because of technical difficulties, I'm relying on someone else to put my slides up. Francesco? Or are we already starting with problems? Oh, there we go. Okay.
Nope, sorry.
So as was said, we're going to talk about emergencies and animal response. So today's presentation is really like an overview, sort of using the 4 pillars as a basis, and just going over the various things that emergency managers, responders, communities, that people should consider when they're looking at animals and disaster response. So next slide. So just before we start, I'd like to start out in a good way, just to acknowledge that I myself am presenting from the unceded territories of the Stalo Nation. I'm out in Mission, BC, for those of you who know where that is. It's in on the west coast of Canada. And I'd just like to have everybody just take a quick moment and acknowledge the First Nations territories that they may be living on, and just to thank those peoples for taking care of the lands from time immemorial. Next slide. So just a brief history. Animals and disaster response was sort of an international thing until around the 80s. So it was primarily international, primarily in developing countries, primarily for livestock, in that communities relied so heavily on livestock. If there was a disaster, that was the main focus of the response. In the 80s, there was a woman called Terry Crisp in the United States, and she sort of started down there this idea of pets and hobby farm type of thing, and more of a Western flavor to disaster response. And this is just some pictures of some disasters. We always like to put this picture of the door. This is a door from a school in a parish of New Orleans. This is people that could not evacuate when they were advised to. They stayed in their homes. When the levees broke and the floodwaters were rising, they took their animals to the closest, safest, highest ground, which was a school. They left their animals in the rooms with food and water, with these notes on the door. Because there was no plans, because there was no provision for animals in the disaster, all the animals in this school were shot. So part of where I come from when I'm doing these presentations is I don't want that to ever happen again to any animals or anything even similar to that. So it's just that people try and do the best for their animals, and we have to help and support them with that. So next slide. So today, as I said, we're going to try and sort of view it through a 4 pillars lens. So we'll go over some mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. Then just a quick slide on sort of what you're going to look for in your animal responders. Now, we put volunteers. It could be staff, but it's the strengths that you want. And then just a little blurb at the end about CDART, little promo, so that everybody knows who and what we are. Next slide. So what I'm going to do as we go through is, the slides are up there. You can read the slides, and I'm just going to sort of talk to the slides. I'm not going to read the slides. So when I look at mitigation for animals, it's more of a, how can we minimize the effect that disasters are going to have on them? So often animals are in more vulnerable areas, lowlands for farms. Animal shelters are quite often in the lowlands and stuff like that. So the question is, from a community planner, is, can you protect those lands? Can you increase the building codes such that barns are more sturdy like houses are? Those type of things. Can you make sure that, can you move your animal shelter so it's not in such a vulnerable situation? Or if you've got all of that, how do you put plans in place to mitigate the effects? And that's part of the next slide, which is preparedness. So it's it's really important that animals are integrated into the overall plan. So often, well, when I started, animals weren't even anywhere in the plan. Now, quite often still, they're sort of, here's the plan, and then the animal piece is over here. It needs to be part of the overall plan. It needs to be fully integrated into the plan. Even though you're going to have your specialized responders to do the actual work, it needs to be part of the plan. If not, then chaos erupts. And then once you've got the plan, you need to reach out and identify your stakeholders. Stakeholders are great. Like, they're the ones that have the expertise. They have the resources. You know, you want to, if you've got cattle in your area, where are the cattlemen? Where are the trailers? Like, they're the ones that know how to wrangle them. Not your man off the street won't probably have that skill set. And then wherever possible, of course, you want to try and put some memorandums of understandings or mutual aid agreements in place so that something's down on paper and it's not ad hoc on the fly. So as we all know, preparedness is a big piece of that. So next slide. So the other piece for preparedness, and especially in regards to responders, of course, is training. So when you're looking at animal responders, they need to be trained the same as any emergency responder, pretty much. So they need the incident command, they have the first aid, those type of things, but they need additional training as well. So when we're working at animal teams, we want a good base of animal responder training so that they can fit in with the overall response. So when we're asking for animals to be in the overall response, we're also, of course, going to be saying, you know, we're going to learn what we need to learn to be part of that response. And then once you've got that base of training, next slide, then you can go to the animal specific response. Now this is Toby, and he is modeling the stylish bra, which a B-cup bra is a very good blindfold for a horse. So when you're dealing with animals and they're agitated, if they can't see, they usually become more calm, more docile, and more easily to handle. And that's the same with pretty much any animal. So depending on the size of the animal, you use different things. Obviously, the training that you get, if you get water training, then you can do the floodwater stuff. If you don't have it, then you're not safe to go in. Just like any other first responder, animal responders follow ICS. Our first goal is always the safety of the responder. So if you don't have the training and the skill set, then you shouldn't necessarily be doing the work, and then someone else will have to do it, or unfortunately, maybe it doesn't get done. We actually have in CDART various smaller adjunct courses. So we'll have like a barn safety course, and some of us have our boating license, these kind of things. There's a number of training facilities and people out there that can give you a lot of this training. It doesn't have to be done yourself. You can get somebody in. And CDART doesn't have people who are trained in all these aspects of things, but we do have a lot of training available. Next slide. So the other part of preparedness, of course, is exercising. So you get an idea of what your capabilities are, and you learn by doing. When we do exercises with animals, obviously we can do this tabletops, etc. But when we do a full-on mock disaster, we use stuffed animals or our imagination. We do not bring in live animals. Even the best, most well-socialized live animal doesn't understand it's a disaster. So we had a exercise and somebody said, well, I have a therapy dog and they're bomb-proof and nothing phases them. Well, we put the therapy dog in a cage and the owner walked away, and the therapy dog was looking at the owner like, where are you going? So we don't want to stress animals from training. We use stuffies for exercises. We do get some hands-on training of animals. Like, we'll go to a barn and, you know, we'll curry a horse, or we'll walk a horse around, or we'll take a shovel and we'll shovel some manure, or, you know, we'll go and learn about dog behaviors or cat behaviors or things like that. But in a mock disaster situation, we use real people and fake everything else. But it's still a good process, and it still reinforces the knowledge from people actually doing the exercise. Next slide. And then the other piece of preparedness, of course, is the public education. So the more your public knows about preparedness and what you're able to bring to the table, the better prepared they can be themselves and the more resilient they can be. The unfortunate thing is, as far as I know, in pretty much every jurisdiction, there's no real funding available for animals. And in Canada, there's no funding available for animals. I know that for sure. So when it comes to that piece, how do you fund these type of things? So we'll go to community events. We ask for donations. If there's a disaster in your area or close by, or it's a big national or international disaster, that's always a good time to do public education because people are sensitized. It's more top of mind. And when you're educating your public, you've got to talk to them about evacuation procedures and then also sheltering in place. So if it's a large disaster, such as an earthquake or something, you may not be able to evacuate. You may need to be staying at home. What does that look like? What supplies do you need? You know, how long do you have to take care of yourself? If it's an evacuation, what does that mean? If it's a tactical evacuation, if your house is on fire and you're running out, there's not much planning that anybody can do. But if it's a situation where there's an evacuation alert, so people are told you may have to evacuate, do they know what that means? Do they know what an evacuation order means? Do they know they can't get back home? The more you can prepare and give knowledge to your public, the better your disaster will be and the more resilient they'll be through the response and of course through the recovery as well. So this is a really important piece. And I find that some emergency managers are like, well, we only do 72 hours. And I always say, well, if you're going to talk to people about sheltering in place, tell them that it could be up to, who knows, weeks, depending on what's going on. The people that will prepare will prepare. The people that won't prepare won't prepare. Even if it's only for 2 hours, they just won't. So let's prepare people as best we can so that our jobs are easier in the event of a disaster. And then you catch them young, like this little guy in the picture. He's very intent upon what I'm telling him. Next slide. So then during the response, the same thing. The response for animals should be integrated into the overall response. Now, this is not to say that we have to be in the reception center or anything, but it needs to be included. It can't be an afterthought or an add-on. Make sure that your animal people don't self-deploy. So when you're putting your teams together as part of the training, that has to really be emphasized. Many people who will join the animal team will be animal lovers. Many animal lovers will just want to go and save animals. So the whole point of getting teams, training teams, will it be that you'll have the skilled people to do it, but they will actually understand the procedures and the policies. And so it'll be safer for them and safer for you. Always be on the lookout, of course, for convergent volunteers. And they're very useful, especially if your trained team is small, then it's very useful to convergent volunteers. And always be aware of managing the information and donations. So like in 2017 was the first big disaster after social media really caught on and everybody had, was on social media and had a smartphone. So we were continually getting donations of food, animal food. We did not need those donations of food after a while. They were stacked up sky high. So manage, if you can, try and manage the information, the donations, such that you get what you need when you need it, but you don't get a bunch of extra things that you need. So it's just a cautionary tale. Social media is really good for getting information out, but it's also really bad if it's bad information. It gets out way too fast and it's so hard to bring it back in. So just be really cognizant of that when you're doing this. Next slide. So obviously you've got your immediate, your 24, 48 hours, whatever, when everybody's evacuating, it's very busy. So you're going to go for the surge. You're going to bring as many team members out as possible. So the options that we have is setting up an animal shelter, helping with evacuations, or maintaining animals in place. Everything you do as an animal responder has to be documented. Animals do not speak our language. The only way that we know where they came from, where they need to go, whether they've been fed, all of that is to write it down or make sure that you've made notes of it. As far as volunteers that you want in your team, obviously you need animal handling expertise. But what people don't realize is in a disaster, most of what we do is paperwork and cleaning and feeding animals. It's not like there's somebody, they're rescuing a llama. Okay, yes, we do that, and that's what everybody thinks of, and that's what everybody wants to do, but you really need volunteers that are happy to stay at home, as it were, in the shelter and do the day-to-day grind, not, as we call it, the sexy stuff, the evacuation of the animals and everything, right? You want to try and give everybody a chance to do it, but people need to understand that that's not the main thrust of what we're doing. The main thrust of what we're doing is keeping the animals safe for their owners until everybody can go back home. So next slide, please. So the response, when I started doing this, we rarely had a response that was even a week long. And now the responses seem to be like all summer long. So when you're looking at your teams, when you're making your plans, when you're on response, how long is it going to last? So as you know, you're planning all the way along as you go, but how long is it going to last? Do you have sufficient human resources for that period? If not, you've got to try and find some more convergent volunteers and get them trained up to a minimum standard. Do you have enough physical resources where you've set up your temporary shelter? Can it be used? So in 2021, we found a place to set up a temporary animal shelter. We had it for a month. We figured, hey, we have it for a month. That's plenty of time. At the end of the month, we had to move and find another shelter because we still were handling animals from the same disaster. And we couldn't get an extension because that particular building was a community hall and they had a wedding. And apparently they still wanted to get married. So we had to move all the animals out. So with everything, you've got to look forward and you've got to see what you're going to do. Now, the one thing that becomes more prevalent and more top of mind as things go on is worker care, resource management. The longer you go on, can you take care of your staff? Are they getting adequate rest? And the problem right now with response with animal responders, and indeed actually emergency responders throughout, especially in my province of BC, because we seem to be busy every summer, is the responders are not getting adequate respite. And so that is always a red flag, and that is a very dangerous thing. If people are not getting sufficient rest, they can start making some very bad decisions. Also, the longer the response goes on, especially if you've been unable to get in to check on animals, feed animals, etc., there might be more of a concern with mortality. So with the Fort McMurray fire, the government of Alberta contracted CDART to come in and do mortality right before re-entry for their residents. So what we basically did, what we were contracted to do, was to come in, recover remains of animals from homes, and then provide emotional support to the owners. Unfortunately, in the Fort McMurray situation, there wasn't very much remains because of the fire had burnt everything to ash. And during the response, there was, we heard anecdotally, when people were evacuating, if they heard dogs barking, they kicked open doors and they rescued the dogs. And then, of course, the doors are open so other animals could escape the house. And even when the actual trained responders went in to evacuate the animals per the requests from the owners, if they heard dogs barking, they did a similar thing. So in addition to people coming out with their animals, official disaster responders coming out with animals, and then people that were evacuating pulling their neighbors' animals, there was potentially open doors all over the neighborhoods with cats running around and everything. So when we went back to do the mortality, we could not say with certainty that the animals were in fact in the home. We could say with certainty that the home had burnt to the ground, but we couldn't confirm one way or the other. And in addition, there was multiple venues where animals were evacuated to and no central registry. So far in my experience, the Fort McMurray situation was the closest to the Katrina situation, the Hurricane Katrina situation. It wasn't as bad, but it was disorganized. And then we went up and did some CDART training in Fort McMurray the following year. So this is good. If I can just say something about response and training, it's better to get trained before the large disasters than after the large disasters. But quite often it's the disaster that triggers, oh, we didn't know what we were doing. We better figure out and find some training. So when you go back to your lives, to your homes, to your towns and whatever, you know, is there a plan? What is the plan? Can we get a plan if there's not a plan? Is it a good plan? That type of thing. So yeah, because otherwise bad things can happen. Bad things can happen to good animals and good people. So next slide. The last piece of response, of course, demobilization. And then is it response or is it recovery? I've put it in response. It's sort of the bridge between the two. At the end of the disaster, ideally, we want to return the animals to their owners. They're very happy. We're very happy. The animals are happy. But there may be situations where the event is over. We have insufficient numbers of animals to be running a shelter. So what we provide is long-term fostering. And the odd time we will do rehoming. It's, as we know, when people are in a disaster situation, they're under high stress. It's not a good time for them to be making permanent decisions. So from CDART's point of view, we try to dissuade people from making a rehoming situation early on in the game. If it seems like it's a good idea, maybe a little bit later, we'll sort of look to doing that with them. But we try to encourage people to keep their animals with them. There's been a lot of research done now, well, a lot more research done now in the area of animals and disaster response. And the research has shown that people have more problems with recovery if they lose their animals than if they lose their house. So even if it's their own decision, we try not to get that decision at least prematurely in the whole disaster scheme. And then of course, at the end of it, we always have the debriefing, the mass debriefing for the end of the response for our volunteers. Next slide. So then the last piece of the pillar is recovery. So when we're looking at recovery for animals, the animals themselves are quite resilient. Like animals live in the present. So if it's presently scary, it's scary. Now I'm taken to a temporary animal shelter. So there's a disaster, it's scary. I'm taken to an animal shelter. The first few days are a little bit scary, but oh, well, okay, this is the way it is. They settle in quite nicely. Then they go back home, maybe a day or two, especially if they don't go back to their old home, their original home. Maybe take them a couple of days to get used to it, but they're very quick. Owners, not quite so much. Being human beings, they're always thinking, what if this could have happened? So what we like to provide as animal responders is ongoing care. So that could be emotional support or resources, could be some vet care necessary. Oftentimes people with animals cannot bring their animals home because they don't have what they need to bring them home. So maybe the barn got burnt down, or maybe the fence is wrecked and you can't bring your animals home. The chicken coop isn't there. So animal owners need sometimes help with getting that infrastructure put in. It's not something that CDART has as part of our wheelhouse, as part of being animal responders. It may be something that should be part of our wheelhouse, but we've got a big enough bunch of stuff on our plate now. But it is something that emergency planners and emergency management folks should be thinking of, because at this point in time, as far as I know, well, for sure in Canada, there is not a charity that provides this service to animal people. You can get your house cleaned, you can get help with your house being rebuilt, et cetera, but not your barns and stuff. It's not a thing. And then ongoing emotional support, especially if animals are confirmed deceased or remain missing. So for instance, in Fort McMurray, as I said, there was a lot of cats missing, and a lot of them some of them did come back, and some of them came back months later. So we, talk to people, we provide that emotional support. We have some of our volunteers are trained in psychological first aid. We take here in Canada, the Salvation Army has an emotional and spiritual support 2-day course. So we take these courses to provide us the tools. We're not professional therapists. So if somebody's really traumatized, we would have to refer them, but we also have that knowledge as well. So next slide. So the other bit of recovery is the fostering. So people may be going home, the event is over, everybody's recovering, but we may be doing long-term fostering until somebody can get that barn fixed. Or what happened in 2021, there was so many communities affected by wildfire and so many houses burnt in BC that there was like a wait list for temporary housing. So people couldn't even go home because they had no home to go to. So there's a longer term need for fostering, sometimes past when the evacuation order is lifted. It's very important when you're doing that longer term fostering is to emphasize with the owners that they need to stay in contact with you kind of on an ongoing basis. We ask for once a week, a little, hi, yeah, we're still here. We didn't get our home yet. Or they're telling us it's going to be next Thursday. Something that so we're in sort of continual ongoing contact with them so that we don't lose track of them after the event. The fosters, the people who are caring for the owner's animals also need ongoing support. So, and it has to be reinforced to them over and over that they're fostering for animals that are owned. We had a situation again in 2021 where the owners were waiting for their temporary housing. They were waiting. It took quite a long time. The long-term foster had the dog for, I think it was about a month and a half or so. And they phoned me and they left me a message saying, yes, our family's discussed it and we've decided to keep the dog. And I was like, what? That's not even a thing to discuss. So yes, had to make a phone call, long conversation. The foster's opinion was if they really loved their dog, they would have done something to figure out a way to have their dog return to them earlier. And so they really didn't love their dog. And now their dog had been with them for a month and a half. And so it was really better to stay with them. And I said, well, but the dog lived with their owners for 5 years. So how does your month and a half trump 5 years? Well, they don't really love the dog because if they did, they would have done something by now. And then you have to explain about, trauma and disaster and all that. So it's better to get out front of that and keep in touch with your fosters on an ongoing basis and keep reinforcing that message. Yes, the owner still wants, yes, we're in touch with the owner still wants their dog, et cetera, et cetera. That being said, on the very rare case if the owner does decide, you know what, I don't think I can handle having my animal back, we will approach the fosters and ask them if they want to keep them because it's less trauma for everybody, but there's no requirement and there's no expectation. And then there's always a plan needed for how to get them back to the owner, or as I said, eventually rehoming. What we found through the years is it's better to keep separation between the foster and the owner. During the disaster, everybody's very emotional and they become best buddies during the disaster and they love each other forever. And then as life goes back to normal, it's okay if both of them kind of part and aren't as interested in keeping that strong bond. But quite often what would happen is one or the other would still want the strong bond and the other person would be moving on. So to stop that from happening, we try and keep them apart. So if somebody's holding an animal in foster, when it's time to go back to the owner, one of our professional volunteers will go get that animal, return it to the owner, rather than have the owner come and pick it up from the foster or the foster deliver it directly to the owner. So just a thing to think about. Keep that small degree of separation between the emotionally charged, untrained individuals, be they evacuees or well-meaning residents and citizens that are being fosters. And as we go through, you'll notice we have all sorts of different animals in the pictures. And the reason we do that is when it comes to animal response, it's an all species thing. Any animals that we've made dependent on us, we should be having plans and resources and responses to take care of them in a disaster. So this is a little rat. Just in case you're wondering, we've got all these different animals. That's why. Next slide, please. The other part of recovery, of course, is the responders themselves. So our CDART volunteers. So when they get home, let us know when you get home. Whenever you're traveling, let us know where you are. We'll have a supervisor or somebody check in maybe a week later. How are things going? How are you feeling? Just sort of try to get a read. Hopefully they've got a good social safety net. They've got friends and family. The problem is if someone hasn't gone through it, sometimes it's hard for them to understand what you've gone through. So other volunteers are really good for that. But some people are so affected and they can't bounce back on their own. So we do have resources that we can, again, as I said, we're not professional therapists, so we can put them towards disaster psychosocial support, or if necessary, critical incident stress management. In BC, there is an actual volunteer group of disaster psychosocial support workers. So they're called the DPS, and they're the purple shirts. We're the gray shirts, just like Team Rubicon. And so they're available to help, and they are actual professional mental health people, mental health professionals. So there is that, there are avenues available if people need more support, but hopefully they can get enough and get just from their own social safety net, and CDART can provide. But if it's beyond our capability, if it's beyond the capability of your team, then you need to have those resources available for people to be referred to. Next slide. And just before I leave that volunteer one, I'll just go back to Hurricane Katrina again. The people that responded to Hurricane Katrina were animal lovers that had the time and the money to go down to Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. They weren't necessarily trained. They weren't even necessarily animal welfare people. They were just animal lovers, some of them. And they'd never encountered anything like what was there. I mean, hell, I'd never encountered anything like what was there. The number of animals and the level of suffering that they had before anybody could go in and rescue them. And it was long hours, and it was very hot, and it was very humid, and depending where you come from, you're not used to that. And there was one volunteer, she basically stopped eliminating. And so I had known her by that time, and she knew that I was kind of trained. And so she was asking me, and she was from Wyoming. So she had at home, she ate a lot of meat, beef. It's a cattle country. The shelter that we were working at and assisting with was a vegan shelter, vegan and vegetarian. So when meals were brought in for us, there was no meat. People would donate stuff, and sometimes it was like jerky and things like that. So I said to her, I said, you need to eat some meat because your body is used to it, and what you're putting your body through physically and what you're putting into your body is not normally what you're used to. And between the two, that's what's caused the problem. So things did get a little bit better. And then wasn't too long after that, she ended up going home with her friend. She thought she was going crazy because she cried, and she cried and she cried and she cried, and she couldn't stop crying. And her friend didn't. So obviously there was something wrong with her, because she had no idea of what might happen to her when she got home. So when you are doing the animal response, it's important that your volunteers, and even your conversion volunteers, your walk-in people, get a little bit of information on the different sort of reaction you might get when you get home. Now, myself, ever since 2003, which was the first major response that I had done, I've been doing it since 1999, but 2003 was the first really big one. My life irrevocably changed as a result of my response to that event. I'm not to say it changed for the worse or the better. It just irrevocably changed. You're never the same after you've seen something like that. So it's important for people to understand that, and that's part of the recovery for them. And then again, we go back to the general piece here. Ensure the animal response is included in the overall debriefs. Like when the event is done and the emergency management, the people in the EOC, Emergency Operations Center, whatever, are getting together, doing the debriefs, the animal responders need to have a presence there. They need to be part of that overall debrief. And then I always put on here lessons learnable. Everybody's like, oh, it's lessons learned. Well, no, having been doing this since 1999, it seems like the same lessons need to be learned every time we do stuff. So we put for CDART lessons learnable because they may or may not be learned, but we have them. And from them, we can develop our best practices. And then our best practices can lead into more mitigation for the future and better mitigation for the future. So again, just to minimize the effect on the animals and their people. Because yes, we're there for the animals, but we're there for animals that are linked to people, that belong with people. So by helping the animals, we're helping the people. So by helping the animals, we're helping the overall response, and we're helping the resilience and the recovery of the individuals, the community at large. And so it's a good thing to do. Next slide. Am I ahead or behind? And what I'm doing, not too bad. Quick, attributes for animal responders. Everybody can take a picture with their things. I mean, essentially you want animal loving people that are going to follow ICS, that can stay calm under pressure, that can, handle, long deployments, et cetera. Age of majority we put on there. Every jurisdiction may have a different age. In British Columbia, you have to be at least 16 to deploy and be covered. For CDART, we would allow people younger than that potentially if the province would, wherever we were responding, would cover them. When we go into the evacuated area as part of our search and response to get out animals that have been left behind or unable to be found or to feed, then people have to be legally an adult in that jurisdiction. So no underagers go into the evacuated area. And we just think that that's wise, because if anything happens, even if a parent gives permission, we just don't want to deal with that. And this is a picture of horse. This is Wassart. We actually have CDART and Wassart have a mutual aid agreement, and they're just across the line from British Columbia. So we can go back and forth. Wassart is a little farther south in Washington. So they kind of said, if it's a disaster that's sort of in northern Washington, can you guys quickly leap over the border? And I said, well, as long as we can get over the border quickly, we'll do it. So we have an MAA with them. Next slide. And then CDART, your partner for animal response, all volunteer, trained in response, able to respond to disasters where animals are affected, able to provide training throughout Canada. So, I mean, I suppose we could train somewhere else, but our training is Canadian based, it's Canadian focused, but we are open to any sort of animal issues and concerns. You can always get a hold of us. Next slide. Now we're going to the Q&A, and then just put the next slide on, and that's my contact information. So if there's an emergency and for some reason you feel you need to call me, that's the phone number. If it's a general inquiry about something I've said during the session here, or something that comes up later, or whether training or anything, and we're willing to help out worldwide. We are Canadian based, and Canadian training is what we have. Then just you can email me, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. As was said at the beginning, I'm a CPA, so it's income tax time in Canada now until the end of April. So any inquiries that come in right now might not get answered quite as promptly. But yes, I'm done, and I think there's a few minutes left. And thank you ever so much for being a wonderful audience and allowing me to present all this information.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. That was great. So much information, such a wealth of knowledge that you have. And you really walked us through the entire emergency management cycle, really highlighting the needs of animals in a way that I think a lot of us haven't heard before. So that was super refreshing. Thank you. We definitely have time for questions around 10-15 minutes. So I have a few with me, and some are coming in. So please, for those of us listening on the call, the webinar, please do feel free to post your questions. So Cheryl, the first question that I have is actually with respect to collaborating with different groups and emergency management agencies, and how that's so effective and important in all types of responses, but particularly in the case of animal disaster response. You talked about having a mutual aid agreement with one entity, but I just wanted to ask a little bit more about how you establish connections and build those relationships before a disaster strikes. We actually have a question from one of our participants on how to establish pre-established memorandums of understanding. What's the process that CDART uses, so if you could speak to collaboration, that would be very helpful.
So because CDART started in British Columbia, and because British Columbia had their own emergency support services, and they had their own methods of what they call supplier consents. So when it comes to like working with veterinarians or pet supply stores, that type of thing, we sort of follow that mandate. We make agreements with them regarding if there's a disaster, they will help out by providing us with whatever services they can provide us. And we would usually try to assign some sort of dollar value to things, but it's essentially it's on a case-by-case basis. And oftentimes we don't have anything in place when we enter into a community, which is why if you've got your own pet team in your own community, then you know, okay, here's all our pet stores, here's all our veterinarians, here's all our groomers. What can they do for us? Are they willing to help in an emergency? If you can get that down on paper ahead of time, that's great. Government agencies, they will deploy us. We don't necessarily have written MOUs with them. However, it would be great if we did, because then we wouldn't have to go through the same process every time we get deployed. A lot of times we will say, can we get an MOU? And the other party doesn't want to, but we will still have an informal relationship with them, because we're not going to cut off our nose to spite our face. We don't have a standard template for MOUs at this time. So it's not like somebody could say, oh, can I see your MOU? It's more like, what can that service or resource be provided to you, and what does that look? So it's just identifying what's in your community, what can you use? So for instance, pet stores, pretty self-explanatory, pet supplies, food, et cetera, et cetera. Groomers, they may be able to provide temporary shelter for some animals because they have cages and whatnot. There may be some animals coming in from a flood or something that need to be washed and groomed because they've gotten contaminated water. So can they help out with that? You have to be very careful when you're dealing with contamination, because hazmat and so there's liability there. So all those pieces just have to be looked at ahead of time. But if it's not in there, and during a disaster, people will step up. Like, we'll get calls from, is there anything we can do to help? That type of thing. And it's important too, when you're looking at your MOUs and your MAAs for your animal team, is your animal team is made up of people. So often when we're looking at animal stuff, we're like, oh, well, we need pet food, and we need cages, and we need leashes, and we need hay, and we need, manure forks, and we need this and this and this. It's like, we also need food and water for volunteers. We may need, a cot or some bedding, or, we need volunteer stuff as well. So a lot of times, if a grocery store, for instance, contacts you, don't just ask for pet food, ask for people food, because you need that as well. So, and then depending on the situation, we will do our own logistics, or sometimes we do logistics through the EOC. And again, that depends on where you're deployed, who's deployed you, and how they want to flow with that. We do have the capability of basically running our own ICS at our own shelter with our own command and all the functions. But if we are being deployed and they say, well, we want you to do A, B, C, but if you want to talk to the media, you have to go through the PIO. If you want to get some supplies, you got to go through logistics, That being said, if someone walks up to our place with a bag of dog food, we don't send them to the EOC to logistics. We keep the dog food and we just feed the dogs. So hopefully that kind of explains what was there.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. You mentioned in your response something around contamination. And actually, I have a question here from one of our guests around the process of quality control for the whole cycle of animal disaster management. So maybe you could speak to, what you have in place for quality control. I know you spoke about lessons learnable, but yeah.
So what we do when we set up I'm going to assume this is primarily dealing with a temporary animal shelter, because we don't have as much control over other situations. We will go out and clean and feed barns, chicken coops, fish tanks, etc. If people say, yeah, just leave it at my house, but can you take care of them? We do that. But in our shelter, we do have policies and procedures and rules for the shelter, how often we clean the cages. Everything is still subject to available human resources and cleaning supplies, et cetera, et cetera. But ideally, our minimum standard is twice a day. We will clean the cages. We won't necessarily we won't fully disinfect necessarily twice a day, because if it's the same animal going back to the same cage, we sort of balance off the cleanliness requirement versus the stress to the animal. Once the animal gets in the cage, they start scenting the cage with their own scent. That becomes their den, their home, their place of safety. If they do that, if they put their own scent in there, and then we go in there twice a day and disinfect it with bleach or some other cleanser, we're just removing their scent. And when they come back in, it's like a brand new place again. So we sort of try and balance it. We clean it, but we don't necessarily disinfect it every day. Anytime there's changing from one cage to another cage, obviously full disinfectant, et cetera, et cetera. We do have people that are trained for hazmat. that know how to put on the Tyvek suits and all of that to go into a situation where it may be a fire that's has some asbestos or something. It could, you know, if we go into a flood water, then we know we have to do a full cleanse afterwards. Same with the animals. If we have a flood situation or a hazmat situation that we know we're going to be doing DEWCOM, part of when we set up the shelter is figuring out where are we doing that, because obviously we have to keep that separate from the ongoing operation so that we don't have cross-contamination. But, and the other point that with CDART, we do not require animals to be vaccinated to enter our proof of vaccination, or even to be vaccinated to enter our shelter. The reason we do that is we want it to be a low, no barrier situation. And we feel that people whose animals are vaccinated, they've got the best protection that's available. And the people whose animals aren't evacuated, that was their choice one way or the other. We've been very lucky, or maybe our protocols are good enough. We have not had an outbreak of disease. I always have to knock on wood when I do that in any of our shelters. And we've had shelters open over a month, and we you know, we space them out as much as we can, et cetera, but we've been very lucky in that way. We are also in BC, we don't have as much of an issue with rabies. So on the volunteer attribute things, we did put rabies on there. We don't worry about it too much in BC. If I was doing it in Ontario, I might be more worried about it, because rabies is more prevalent, for instance, in Ontario and in different places in the world. So you might want to look at that. That's human vaccinations to keep us safe. Hurricane Katrina, there was tons of things donated, and the animals were coming in. They were starving, they were dehydrated, they were completely stressed out. And as part of the intake with the group that I was with assisting down there, they were giving them like vaccinations, flea control, deworming, like all upon entry. And I was like, but they're so debilitated already. Are we really doing the best thing for them? And then back in the olden days, we didn't have the animals even long enough for vaccines to take place, like to be effective, because now we do, because we have them like for months, but back in the day we didn't have it. So basically we keep everything really clean and neat. We disinfect for sure in between every animal if they're changing cages. If it's a long disaster, we will disinfect, quote unquote, as needed. So if somebody gets sick or vomits or something, or like once a week or something, we'll do the full disinfectant. But on an ongoing basis, we just do a clean so that the animals have that space that's their own, that can smell like them.
Perfect.
And by the way, we can't usually smell it. It's just an animal. You have to have an animal nose to smell it.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you, Cheryl. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. I have a question around training. So you spoke to how CDART offers certain training, a lot of hands-on training, but can you speak to the potential role of modeling and human-computer interaction in exercises? You know, have you seen that being used?
CDART hasn't done a lot of online anything, really. Most of our stuff is in person. A lot of that is because we're doing team building at the same time, and we find that the in-person stuff is better. There would be, like, in place of like a tabletop thing, there's definitely a place for computer modeling and online responses. And if somebody wanted to take that piece on and help develop that, we could do that. And then we could have like virtual training sessions where we could set up virtual animal shelters and work it through that way. And that would definitely broaden the scope of where we could teach people. Right now we've got an introduction course, which just gives a base, so that the idea of our introduction course is by the end of the course, if you had to, you could run an animal shelter. You might not know everything, you might not be, too experienced, but you've got the basic tools to do it. Then we build on that with a sheltering workshop where we actually do a physical mock-up, which could potentially be done virtually. And then we also have emergency animal first aid course. And we also ask everybody that is a CDART member has ICS. And then, as I said, we've got barn safety, we've got dog behaviors, so that you can try and figure out if it's going to eat you or not. Barn safety is like, which end of the horse is dangerous? Both. Then we've got cat trapping, so live trapping. So if we need to go out and get animals, we can live trap them. And we have various specialists come in. So on your team, if you have an animal team, you're building an animal team, you want to have people that know about all different species, because we do all different species. If you don't have somebody on your team, because you can't always find everybody or recruit them, hopefully you can find somebody that will give you that expertise by phone or by computer or something. So for myself, we don't have a real big, what I would consider a reptile subject matter expert. So, but there is somebody that's a phone call away for me, and she knows pretty much everything about reptiles, so I can phone her. And she actually sourced rodents for us in Fort McMurray when we got there, because when we were doing the mortality, what we found was there was a lot of exotic pets, like reptiles, snakes, lizards, turtles, amphibians, whatever. And they were there and they were alive, but they were very hungry. So we had to source some food for them. And so I just reached out to my reptile gal over here in BC and said, how can I get rats and mice in Edmonton? And I got them delivered to the hotel for the freezer. I said, just say it's special food. Don't tell them it's rodents, because I wasn't sure how they would feel about that, even though they're frozen and it's not a health hazard or anything. So yeah, so there's just, you just had to think, what do I need? How can I get it? And as much as possible, have it in place ahead of time. And if not, you think on the fly, because it's disasters.
Thank you. I have one last question. It might be, I know we just recently had a pet emergency services training that you offered at York University. The question is specifically about whether there's specific considerations for evacuating with pets during emergency situations. And I think that there's a lot that you can say there, but perhaps you can just comment on pets versus livestock, and if you have farms or poultry, etc. Like how
so basically what it boils down to is, if you cannot get all your animals out in one trip, you better start evacuating them as soon as you know you might have to evacuate at the alert stage. You need to practice loading your animals in trailers. It's not enough just to have a trailer. Can you get them in? The time to train your horse to go into a trailer is not when the floodwaters are rising or the fire's coming down the hill. And you're stressed. When you're stressed, your animals know you're stressed, which makes them stressed, which means if it's something that you don't normally do and you haven't practiced and you're doing it now, it's going to take longer. So same, even something as putting your cat in a crate. Like, so many people, they can't get their cat in the crate. You can't carry your cat like this. You don't want to take your dog outside off leash and tell him to jump in the truck. You can't expect your horse to just walk into the trailer if the last time the horse was in the trailer was when he was delivered to you. Do you have a trailer? Do you have a trailer? Is it roadworthy? Do you have something that can tow it? Do you have gas? Like, all of these things you have to think about when you've got the animals over and above your other stuff. So, and if you have to make multiple trips, then you got to start ahead of time. Don't leave home without them. If it's not safe for you, it's not safe for them. First responders will come. They'll knock on the door, the police, SAR, whoever. You got to get out. You got to get out. Do I need to bring my animals? No, they'll be fine. No, they won't be fine. So, and that happened too during the ice storm back in Quebec in the way back years. Like, people left home and they left their animals, or there'll be a chemical spill. Well, if it's not safe for you to breathe the air, how is it safe for your animals to breathe the air? But they just want you out. So the more you practice at home and the quicker you can get your animals confined and evacuated, the better off you are in general, even for a tactical evacuation. And if you've got the time, get them out ahead of time. Try and find a place where you can take your animals, where you can be with them. They're going to be way happier with you than with me in a temporary animal shelter.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Cheryl. I wish this was live so we could hear our round of applause, but I'm sure everybody listening in really appreciated.
Yes, I hear it all the way.
I'd like to pass the floor back to Leila just to close off the session and introduce the next series.
Thank you so much for having me. Okay.
Hello again, everyone. It's great to have you all here. Thank you all for joining us today. I sincerely thank Cheryl Rogers for their outstanding presentation and Professor Aida Mamuji for moderating this session. Our next session is scheduled for May 16 at the same time as today. Professor David Etkin will be our speaker, presenting on disasters are fat-tailed, why it matters, and what to do about it. We'll update you through the Y Emergency for LinkedIn pages. Please consider following us on these platforms to stay updated if you haven't already. Your participation in this lecture series means a lot to us, and we are eagerly looking forward to seeing you at the next one. Have a wonderful day and goodbye.
Thank you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.